Good evening in Tokyo, good afternoon in Europe and Africa, and good morning in the Americas. And a special good morning to those of you in California who are getting up at such an early hour. And hello to the many more people that will be accessing this event after the event. And above all, hello and welcome to our distinguished speakers who are with us today. My name is David Simmons, and I'm the Executive Director of the EMBA Global Consortium. The idea for today's event grew out of the roundtables that were in many ways the standout element of the virtual International Week that we have been obliged to run during the past 2 years because of COVID. The success of those sessions suggested that there would be an appetite for sharing global knowledge on a more regular basis across all our members. So today is the first of what we intend to be a regular series on major themes relevant to our EMBA students. But today also marks what I might call our return to core principles as we plan and present our first face-to-face International Week program for 3 years. You'll be hearing a lot more about these in the coming days and weeks, and we hope you will want to join us in September. For those of you who are new to the consortium, you can see here how our member schools are genuinely part of a global network spanning 4 continents and 16 time zones. And here is just a taster of the programs, the different program themes that will be offered by each of our schools in September of this year. Watch out for more detail in your inbox soon. And I'd now like to pass over to introduce our distinguished speakers for today's event. Thank you.
I am with you today on behalf of the Keio Business School, from which I graduated in 1990 and am currently a visiting part-time professor. I am also a student. I am speaking with you right now from Oxford University in the UK, where I am attending a seminar related to my DBA studies at UBIS University in Geneva, Switzerland, where I will be next week. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you.
Thank you, Edward. We're looking forward to have you as a first speaker, but first, over to the next one. Max Gini, would you introduce yourself, please? Do we have Max? I can't see or hear anything. Otherwise, we'll quickly move on in the interest of time. Seems like we have an audio problem there. So in the meantime, maybe Dieter, maybe you can jump in and introduce yourself until we can get Max online.
Perfect. Thanks so much, Anna, and good day, everybody. It's really great to be with you. To introduce myself, my name is Dr. Dieter Veldsman. I'm originally from South Africa, but I'm also speaking to you currently from Rotterdam in the Netherlands. I'm an organizational psychologist, and currently I look after the thought leadership team at the Academy to Innovate HR, and really looking forward to our conversation today as we talk about, in my view at least, why I think the future is becoming a lot more human. So look forward to the session.
Thank you so much. And over to the next one. It's Jose Augusto Figueiredo. Did I say that right? Well, I'll let you introduce yourself so I learn to pronounce your name properly.
Yes, it's okay. It's Figueiredo.
Thank you.
Figueiredo. Hi, everyone. I'm talking from Rio de Janeiro, Brazil. I'm Brazilian. I work for a company named Lee Hecht Harrison. I'm the CEO in Latin America, and I'm also a board member for the MBA, for the COPEAD, the Institution of Business of the University of Rio de Janeiro, Federal of Rio de Janeiro. And it's a big pleasure to be here.
Thank you so much. Well, I already introduced myself, so that made straight over to Sudhir Kadam. Can you introduce yourself, please, to our audience?
Thank you, Anna. This is Sudhir Kadam. I'm a venture partner at FIDA Growth Partners in the Silicon Valley. I handle portfolios which comprise of B2B frontier tech startups in AI, NLP, AR, VR, computer vision, IoT, robotics, and autonomous enterprises. My role at FIDA is to do venture building and to put startups with early adoption on path of growth and scale. I also conduct programs in entrepreneurship and innovation at San Jose State University for master's and EMBA programs. And I'm also advisor for digital marketing program at California State University in Chico. Thank you.
Thank you. And last but not least, Mark Weinstein, would you introduce yourself, please?
Yes. Hello, everyone. And so good to see I'm supported by my colleagues here in Miami in the chat area. My name is Mark Weinstein. I'm a professor of human resource management at Florida International University. I'm also the director of our graduate program in human resources. We have both an online and face-to-face program. Over the years, I've worked on a number of areas related to employment systems and have had a number of, really lucky to have great support from the National Institute for Occupational Safety and Health and NIH for a lot of my work.
Thank you. So with that, we are going to get going. And what we've gathered here today to do, we're going to talk about future work. So for me personally, it's 80% of what I do right now, how we work at Microsoft, how others work, how our customers work. And because of that, we decided, today we're going to take you on a journey across the whole world, not just geographically, but also with all the different aspects that we identified around the future of the work and workplace, from ethics and philosophy to really hands-on what's the future workplace and office actually going to look like. So with that, our first speaker, Edward, are you ready? Because I'm going to hand off to you now.
I sure am. Thank you very much, Anna. Again, good day, everyone. Good morning or good evening or good afternoon, wherever you might be. I would like to speak for about 5 minutes, maybe a little bit more, on the subject of business ethics. Now, as I mentioned earlier, I'm here in Oxford. I'm at Mansfield College in Oxford, attending a seminar on global business. And interestingly, one of the subjects which is being covered is exactly the same topic as the forum today. It's the future of work. And one of the subjects that we covered in great detail happened to be supply chain management. And an interesting point was raised that until the last 18 to 24 months, supply chain management was not a very sexy subject in business administration. It was something that was sort of in the back of people's mind. It wasn't a very, very high level strategic priority for most companies. People thought of supply chain management in terms of just mere logistics. But as the COVID crisis compared with and also joined with geopolitical crises that we have in the world right now, everybody knows that supply chain management is now at the very top. It's at the center of business administration, and so you never know.
San Jose State ka hai.
So you never know what subject will wind up right in the center of strategic importance. But I believe one of these fields is business ethics. Business ethics is something that people may mention from time to time, but it hasn't been thoroughly studied or even in many cases required in most business programs, either at the undergraduate, MBA, or DBA level. So I'd like to talk just for a few minutes about what ethics is and why I believe this is important. First of all, you can't critically analyze something until you have defined it. And there are several definitions of business ethics, and all of them are a little bit problematic. The definition that I like, can we go back to the previous slide just for a moment? Yes, the center, this is the dictionary definition, which raises far more questions than I think that it answers. The bottom is my definition. Ethics are rules of behavior that, if violated, invite social censure when they're exposed. And of course, there are different levels of behavior that you may violate. And once you get above a certain line, then ethics becomes codified and becomes laws, which are enforced by states with force. The problem is where these lines are, where the gray zones exist, are different from culture to culture. Next slide, please. The reason that I find the reason I find business ethics interesting is we now have, as a result of previous slide. Next one. There we go. Thank you. Thanks to 200 years of globalization, we have about 200 years of experience now with the concept of standardization. And if you look at these, if you look at all of these fields, you'll see that a great number of things in our lives are now subject to global standards, which everyone accepts. Sometimes they're not accepted 100% in some cases, but basically, these are the things which allow societies to trade with each other. It allows them to do commerce together. It allows them to invest in each other's countries. It allows exchange of all of the things that are involved in globalization. But if you think about it, the world does not yet have any formally globally recognized standards regarding executive or managerial behavior. And in fact, even though people were talking about this 30 years ago, most business schools all over the world today provide little or no ethics training, even as electives. Next slide, please. This slide this is a very busy slide. I apologize a little bit. There's a lot of information on this slide, but basically, please just go from left to right along the bottom. So historically, how do ethical principles get formed? And they get formed when things like, so very community specific, usually, historically geographically limited, things like values, religious traditions, business institutions, NGOs, media, personal relationships. Historically, these things just sort of all naturally, by trial and error, they gradually create community-specific local norms, a set of ethical principles, a set of behavior of right and wrong that everybody agrees to. But now, if you go to the top, we're in a new situation now. We have globalization. We have globalization, and you have worldwide events which lead to localized consensus, which merge to form regional consensus, which in turn provides a global consensus. And eventually you wind up with something called hypernorms. And hypernorms are universally accepted standards of behavior. And there is a lot of debate as to whether or not those exist now. But if they don't, they certainly are forming. And the yellow parts of this slide are the focus of my doctoral research right now on the role of global social media in forming, in particular, the localized consensus, which are a part of this process. Next slide, please. So these are sort of some discussion questions to think about, asking yourself as if you're involved in any way in international business or international commerce or trade or even education. How safe do you feel that you know exactly where the lines are, even in your home country? How confident are you that you understand what acceptable rules of behavior are in all of the world's roughly 200 countries and territories? And finally, what resources are available to you so that you can help from blowing yourself up or getting yourself into some trouble in either a minor way throughout your business career in the future? And with that, I will conclude my remarks and ask if there are any questions.
So David, would you have a look in the chat? Is there any comments or questions that we can raise at this point? He's on mute. We keep doing that, don't we?
I'm sorry, I put myself on mute because I've been admitting people, and each time I admit somebody, it beeps here, and I didn't want to disturb you. But I can't see any questions immediately coming through, but if there are any questions, feel free to unmute yourself and ask Edward directly.
And of course, yeah, so I would say we're going to have ample time afterwards for more discussions if you want to think first and you're too shy. But there was the one thing, Edward, that I would like to point out. You said something that really resonated with me here, and that was that there still hasn't been any kind of global, can you repeat what you said, managers' standards on how to really, run management in this world. And that's what I keep hearing from my customers is one of the key things. What made you say that? And could you just double click on that a little bit?
Sure. For example, until fairly recently, if you were, let's say you were an American, and you were being transferred to work in your company's office in Germany. As an American, you're very, very familiar with American rules and regulations and social codes, and you're very aware of what is acceptable, ethically and socially. And even when you're in Germany, let's say this American manager, he or she goes to Germany. Historically, these people have tended to live sort of in a bubble. They tend to sort of in a bubble. Very frequently, these people are an overseas subsidiary of their parent company back in the United States. So even though they are living and working in Germany, they're still working in, for example, an American business environment where they don't necessarily need to understand the outside rules. They're sort of embedded. They're sort of embedded within this within their home country culture. Increasingly, this is just not the same anymore. Increasingly now you have people who are living and working all over the world, and they are not sort of protected by an environment, either culturally or business wise, that they brought with them from their home country. Now they are truly living and working in the host country. And in many cases, they don't fully understand the differences in values and the different ethical rules which apply.
Thank you so much. So this really also leads into Max's presentation. Max had some technical issues. Are you with us now? Yourself on camera.
Yes, I'm here.
Because you're going to talk about the science of teamwork, and I just feel that really builds exactly upon this point. And how do you lead teams in the future? And we're going to have some more discussions once we've seen all the presentations. So, Max, and feel free to introduce yourself a minute there at the beginning, as we lost you just when you were on before.
Yeah, fantastic. Thank you very much. Well, first of all, my expertise in emotional intelligence. I've worked on emotional intelligence since 2000, and that's my passion and that's my profession. And I try to use emotional intelligence for leadership, teamwork, and change making, just to start from what neuroscience taught us. And so starting from the mechanism and not just on the theory. So this is it. I'm a professor at Bologna Business School and at the University of Bologna, where I teach people management courses. This is it. So let me start with the idea I'd like to share with you today. So let's go with the next one. That's great. The science of teamwork. And let's go directly in, because I was thinking, what is the real topic for us when we think about the future? And so I decided to try to look back in order to look forward. And if you look at the statement that will appear on the screen, it's quite interesting, because it's crucial to understand that probably we have had the opportunity to be here today to discuss with Zoom, just because we decided to team up and try to fight with the animals that probably were more powerful than us, and so on. But collaboration was one of the key of our development and our evolution. So if collaboration was a key point in the past, well, probably we could say that will be the key point for the future. Why? Because when we talk about VUCA time and so on, so volatile, uncertain, and so on, and I mean, I don't want to talk about that because it's quite clear thinking about the last few years. And so probably the more we have to work in a very difficult environment, the more we need to team up in order to accomplish very different tasks. So if we go ahead, we can see that there's one scientist, one professor from MIT. So next slide. And the professor from MIT is a remarkable professor. His name is Alex Sandy Pentland. And he said in his book of 2014, well, guys, I've discovered something that is about 50% of team performance. Wow. So if team performance and team up with all the other guys in companies could be a key factor to be competitive in the future, we have the man who knows, the man who can bring us in this new world of team. And so we decided at the University of Bologna to ask Professor Pentland to give us his technology. So we can go with the next slide. And at the meantime, I'd like to share with you the technology we started with. So this very simple badge, I hope you can see it, okay? And there's in the slide too. So quite easy, a little badge you can wear when you talk. And the idea of this badge is to record your voice in order to have a collection of data about communication and pattern of communication. Then we decide, in order to explore more, to add, and we can go ahead, another app, and is the TeamX app. TeamX is a team performance app who try to put together emotional intelligence, artificial intelligence, and team processes. Just to understand, with this sample of 57 teams, if there were some drivers of team performance we could measure and so be accountable. Let's go ahead. And I don't want, of course, to share all these formulas with you. I'm not so sadistic today, but the results of all this analysis go with the last point in the slide. So please go where we see, no, one step ahead, please. One step back, please. 2 step back, please. 3 now. Thank you, David. So there's probably something missing in the slides, but it's okay. We were talking about the opportunity to explain more or less 60% of team performance. So more of what Professor Pentland said. And what we discovered is that the perception of people is quite reliable. And so we can substitute all the technology to, in some way, collect all the data in terms of communication and so on, that of course has an impact on people, and work on the perception of people in terms of collaboration, in terms of all the things we have asked people to share with us. Few minutes, but it was enough in order to understand that if we have the perception of a group who were working well, then we had good results. And the results were not self-perceived, but with an interesting team building activity. Of course, it's not the overall performance, it's a way to measure performance, but it was a way to have a numeric way to measure performance. And so what was interesting in this opportunity we had is that we did this study in 2019, and it was great. We said, well, we have a driver, and all this study was held, of course, in the same room, not virtual, but with all the people present. And at the end of the results, we had COVID. I said, well, now the world is not the same, so we can go ahead. And the idea was, let me try to understand what happened in this strange world now. So go ahead with the slide, please. And the results, we ended last week, so very, it's something really fresh, said that you can go ahead. The difference with the pre and post is more or like that. So the level of emotional intelligence in terms of recognizing emotion, empathy, and so on are going down. And that's a problem. And that's a problem because we have lots of fears and emotion and unpleasant emotion. And after COVID or during COVID, just to be correct, well, this kind of perception of using and create empathy and so on is going down. So my suggestion, just to close and to end the presentation, is we need to, if we want to have a team performance boost, push more on emotional intelligence, permit people to understand that even virtually, you can work on your emotion, on empathy, and so on. It's quite different, and we need to learn how to do it. And that's the reason why we need a digital literacy, because otherwise it's impossible to create connection in a meaningful way through a medium like Zoom or Teams and so on. And then let me say, considering is more difficult to create empathy and pleasant emotion online, probably we need to use tools in order to be accountable of emotion and so on. Because when you are in the same room, it's easier to connect with people because mirror neurons fire and so on. On the other side, when we are from our home or home office and so on, it's so important to have a way to structure the process and collect emotions and use tools in order to be supported in this activity. So this is it for today and for my brief presentation, just to give you an idea. So the idea is collaboration probably is a key factor for the future. We were aware of the drivers of team performance. Now the things are changed a little bit, and we need to reconsider the tools and the competencies we need to push in order to maintain a high level of results. If you have questions or comments, of course, feel free. I'm here to discuss with you, and it's a real pleasure. Let me see.
Thank you, Max. We do. I think we do have one question here coming in from Sarah. So either Sarah, speak up, or if you quickly read it, or I'll read it out loud for everyone here. Random thought. Nowadays, we interact with people with a mix of physical interactions and usage of digital tools, Teams, Slack, email. Any thought on how we can measure and evaluate digital interaction between the team members? Any tips? I have one, but I'll let you answer first.
First of all, thanks, Sarah. It's an interesting question, of course. And my idea is, well, it's true, it's difficult, as we said, of course. I wouldn't suggest to collect data without be really clear with people about what we are doing. So we worked a lot in the last years on people analytics and so on, and now technology, of course, permits us to do very interesting things. But in order to maintain trust, I wouldn't take data from emails and so on. What I suggest is be clear on what you ask people and when you collect this kind of data. Of course, my suggestion, the little tip is don't leave emotions behind. Don't leave emotion under the cover. Use tools, easy, I mean, simple surveys, just one question and so on, in order to collect the emotional state. It's easy, you can do it with the emoticons or something like that, but really, I would suggest at the end of each meeting to have 1 minute to collect emotions. And probably it's not useful to ask people, how do you feel, if they are not emotional literate? Because the risk is to say, who cares about emotion? Why are you asking me such a personal question? So sometimes it's useful to ask a question, an open question, and then probably use an algorithm in order to extract emotions, like a sentiment analysis, or simply try to reconnect the emotion on a chart on pleasant and unpleasant, and you do the software-like activity. Because maybe it's easier to maintain people in their schema and use these schemas in order to permit them to see the value of emotion and the value of interactions.
Thank you so much. I mean, there's a lot to unpack here. So for the tools and evaluate digital interaction in my slot, I'll take that point because that was one of the things I was going to touch on anyway, and give the Microsoft view on that. But you know, just food for thought here before we move to Dieter as a speaker for you and the audience. You know, this is kind of really explaining why a Robert the robot is not going to come and take our jobs, because you know, this EQ, that's what's going to be the USP for people in teams. Even if automatization and AI, you know, it's one of those big topics. Are they going to come and take my job? No, they're probably not. But why don't you think a little bit about that? And we have that in a bigger discussion after the end. And with that, I would say over to you, Dieter. Stage is yours.
Thanks so much, Anna. And I think that's a wonderful intro for the topic that I would love to cover in the next couple of minutes, around why I actually believe that the future of work is becoming more human. And I think at the moment we're talking a lot about human-centric workplaces and what that really means. And what I'd like to do in the next couple of minutes is really make two arguments. The first argument is, as a human being in this future workplace, what is it that I should be thinking about? And I think what are some of those pertinent questions that we should consider? And then on the other side, what is the implication for organizations? And how are we going to respond from an organizational point of view to really think about what the human being and as human beings, our interaction and our engagement with work is going to look like in the future as well. So David, if we go to the next slide, I think just to set the tone, and I'm not going to dwell too long on this, but I think we can all acknowledge how, where, and when we work has fundamentally changed. And that's not just due to COVID-19. I think that's been something that's been coming along in terms of the changes of the fourth industrial revolution, but also on the other side, this changing relationships that we have between human beings and machines, robots. Anna, your comment about Robert the robot, technology augmentation, what type of work gets done by human beings. And I think we're starting to see where the world is shifting towards really is around this displacement of labor. There's a shortage of critical skills. I'm going to touch on that as well, Max. I think you spoke a lot about digital literacy, digital dexterity, but we also need to talk about, as much as technology is bringing people together, in some parts of the world, it's also actually increasing levels of inequality around access to technology, access to skills, the ability to participate in certain contexts as well. So where does this leave us if we go to the next slide as a human being? And I think there's 4 pertinent questions we all need to ask ourselves at the moment when we think about the future of work. And the first one is really the question around, but why do I work? And I think there's a trend that we are starting to see where people are starting to question this question around, you know, I want to seek purpose within my vocation. If I'm going to spend, and depending on which study you believe, 60, 70, 80% of my adult life at work, you know, why does it matter? And why am I actually going to make a contribution towards not just me, but my community and my society as well? And that leads us to the second point around, we're seeing that our professional identity is changing. The way that people position work in their life, I think for a number of years, we were talking about the fact that people had work, built their life around work. I think that's fundamentally shifting, where people are saying, but where does work now fit into my life? And how am I going to think about that as well? And we're reevaluating what does that contribution look like. And for organizations, this means we have to think differently about what a job is, what a career is, and how we provide meaningful experiences and actually focus on meaningful and decent work as well. If we go to the next slide, the next question we then really need to ask ourselves then is, but where do we work and how do I work? And I think something that we've all spoken about today already is remote and distributed ways of work. You know, the opportunity to be on a platform like today with people from all around the world. I think we are starting to see that how I work and when work takes place is also to become a very important factor for a human being to consider. And there is the shift towards skills-based experiences, where I think a lot of people at the moment are reevaluating to say, if I've got a particular skill set, how can I transfer that and utilize it differently in the context of different experiences that I want to collect over time? I'm a very big fan of the notion that, you know, a career is no longer a succession of roles over time, but it's a collection of meaningful experiences and the application of skills in different contexts. And I think that's going to become very important. And we're starting to see that a lot more in some of the platforms around skills-based things like open talent marketplaces, gig work, nomad work, etc. And then the third one there around, we have to think about how technology is going to augment work, not automate and replace work only, because I think that was the argument that we spoke about quite a lot, but what does collaboration look like in this different context? And Max spoke about that, I think that is a fundamental thing for us as human beings to think about. So as we click the next one there, David, for organizations, what does this mean? We have to consider changing business models. I think we have to get to grips with what does our new business models look like in this digital ecosystem and ever-connected world. We have to think about well-being. I think a big topic at the moment, but something that isn't spoken about enough, as well as personalization, because the trick is going to be that everybody wants something else from work and they want to work in a different way. And how do we balance the need of the individual and the human with the requirements of the organization and the requirements of a society as well? On the next slide, our third question that we have to then ask really is around the fact that, but when do I work? Asynchronous work is becoming a thing. Collaboration with teams that never ever see each other. So if you're on the line today, do you feel included because you're on technology? If you're listening into this post the live event, do you still feel like you belong because you were not in the same time zone? And teams are going to have to rethink and reshape, and we are going to have to help leaders to touch on what Edward mentioned at the beginning around how do you lead teams in this virtual setting and in this virtual environment. And I think new emerging employment agreements, you know, at some stage, a permanent contract was this gateway for you to be part of the organizational culture, to be included, to be involved, to get employee benefits. And I think that's changing because predominantly your workforce might not work for you all of the time. And what does that mean for organizational culture? And flexibility and trust, I think that's going to become currency for us in terms of when I work. Organizations need to trust. Individuals are going to start expecting flexibility. It's no longer a perk, it's a main requirement. If we click to the next one, for organizations, we're going to have to rethink really around our anywhere, anytime work models. I still deal with a lot of CEOs. They say, I want to optimize flexibility as long as they're in my office every Tuesday morning at 8 o'clock for our face-to-face meeting. You know, other than that, they can be completely flexible. And that's not the way that the world is going to work going forward either. Talent marketplaces will shift where we find talent, how we bring talent on board. And I think we've spoken enough about collaboration and how are we going to design work for intentional collaboration around things like creativity, emotional intelligence as well. The last question we need to ask on the last slide then really is also around the fact to say, but with who do I want to work? And as a human being, I think we are finding this trend that most people want to align themselves with brands that have a stance and a voice, brands that matter. Organizations, I think, can no longer just be on the back foot and not involve themselves in societal and macro environmental issues. We need to ask the question around what do you really stand for and what do you stand against? And I think we're seeing a lot of that in the world currently. And as human beings, I think with this critical skill shortage, people will align themselves a lot more with brands that they really feel that values alignment with, where they feel that ethical responsibility is actually being lived out and is actually being not just talking the talk, but actually walking the walk there as well. And it means that the psychological contract will change. What you want from an employer is going to be very, very different than what it was 10, 15, 20 years ago. Might have been stability. For now, it might mean something completely different. And if we click to the next one, organizations are going to have to think about this really in the context then of what does sustainability look like and what is our contribution towards the greater good or towards the social mandate or towards solving some of the bigger challenges that goes beyond just the border of one organization. And also really value systems. What is it that we look like as an organization, and what are those value systems that we reinforce? And how does that really ingrain into the type of talent that we want to attract as well? So to summarize on my last slide, David, I think there's 4 questions that we have to ask ourselves as an individual here in terms of my professional identity. Who am I as the human being in the context of work? And the first one is, what role does work play in your life? For some people, you know, it's the end all be all. For others, it's a component that they need to fit into other priorities that they have within life that they need to balance. What are the expectations that you have from work? For some people, it's going to be very different than others. For some, it is about ambition, success, output, outcomes. But for others, it might be the contribution that I am able to make through work to my local community or to other people that I deal with and other people that I interact with. And then what's the expectations from an employer? Because I think that is fundamentally shifting and changing. And be clear about what is your non-negotiables about what a good employer looks like for you. Is it about care for you as an employer? Is it about opportunity? Is it about exposure? And how are you going to balance that? And lastly, I think, what is your contribution? What difference have you made through the work that you've made in the world? And I think especially people on the latter stage of their career, asking the question around, but what do I leave behind? What is the legacy that I want to leave? And what is the story that I want people to tell about my contribution as a human being in the future of work as well? And I'll pause it there, and I think from a time point of view, but I think amazing things for us to ponder, and a very, very interesting time to think about the human being in the workplace.
Thank you, Dieter. We're really seeing a red thread here, and you'll hear more about this later on. This is, you and I probably need to connect separately here, because this is a lot of our philosophy in my company. But you didn't say it loud, but because with the current times, it's not a word that one should use easily. But you're pretty much saying this war for talent, as it's that has been used as an expression. That's really what we're going into. And exactly this, Julia is asking in the chat as well. So I'll read that to you. I totally agree with this fluid way of looking at this matter. Do you believe that the future of business can be considered as employee-centric and not only product and service-centric? How long do you think it would take for a mid-sized business to shift to this new perspective? That's a really good question. Dieter, what do you think?
I think there's a few things to consider there. I think the first reality is there's more than one party that has to be involved in this conversation, right? Where I sometimes do get worried around us only talking about employee-centric workplaces is that there's still an organization that's got a certain mandate and a certain purpose to deliver. And I think there's a balance there around clearly articulating the expectations of both parties. I think for too long, organizations have had the overhand there a little bit around what they dictate and how flexible they are with regards to that. I think the shift that we are starting to see is opening that up a little bit more. I do believe, though, that it does invite a lot more dialogue then around, but where does the human being fit and what are we able to accommodate, or what is our appetite as an organization? Let's make it practical. I don't think there's anything wrong for a small organization to say, you know what, flexible working, remote working from anywhere in the world is not something that we can endorse currently where we are now. But then be very explicit about that so that the talent that is attracted to you as an organization knows that that is the boundary and that's not something that they should expect from you as an employer. If you then run into the trouble to say, but I can't find the talent, you have to reevaluate as an organization, but maybe I should amend and adapt some of my own practices. But then importantly, again, to touch on what Edward has said, to make sure then that we equip our leaders to be able to then lead in that particular way, because I've seen that quite a bit, where leaders are not equipped to lead in these new models. And that's then where it fails. It's not because the organization can't handle it. It's because of an individual leader not being able to get there. So I think there's work to be done. I think we are able to shift there if we want to, but it is about explicit and very, very clear guidelines and guardrails that we do need to put down.
Thank you. I mean, what we will see in the future is pretty much, that the talent is going to go where the best of most flexible workplaces that delivers this. And it's a simple universal truth. If you don't do it, someone else will, right? Yeah, you agree with that?
Yeah, I think it's an interesting point, because I do think we also need to rethink our definition of what does talent look like, because I think in a skills-based economy, there's other ways of thinking about a job and a role. And I think there's other ways also about thinking about how work gets done. And I think there's very interesting things on the horizon for us in the domains of organizational design and work redesign, and thinking about that, especially then also in the domain of technology augmentation. But in short, yes, you need to have an attractive employee value proposition. You need to be able to sell to talent, why should I choose you and why are we the right fit? Why should we go beyond the dating stage and actually involve ourselves in a longer term marriage?
Great way of putting it. And I have to, in my own interest here, as I'm chairwoman for our women's network. To be honest, this is also one of those key things to be able to combine family and, create future generations, because we are getting older, the population is getting older.
Okay.
And it's really hard to combine family and work. So this is really supporting that. So thank you for putting that out there today. And I hope to get some more context around this, maybe from the women here in the audience. We have almost 100 people actually, so well attended today. Great to see so many being interested. So with that, thank you, Dieter. Let's move on to Jose. Are you ready to take the stage? Go ahead, please.
Thank you, Anna. It's a great pleasure to be here. And congratulations, Dieter, great presentation. I mean, everything is about self-awareness, self-knowledge, and reflection, purpose, and identity. And it makes the emotional intelligence play a big role on that. It's amazing. So everyone, I'm going to show you a source of data that you're going to find a lot of information about everything that Dieter and Max has already talked. Could you move on, please, David? So I bring here a global study that was provided by the company I work for, the group, Adecco Group. It's something that happened a year ago, May or June last year, almost 15,000 respondents, 25 countries. It's pretty much global. And it's something that can enrich the conversation that we had before. Could you move on, David, please? 5 areas emerge about the issues related to work environment that we are seeing today and probably will affect our future. I will cover the last 2, but you can find the data at the adecco.com about the hybrid, and I know that Anna is going to cover a little bit about that. Shorter and flexible work, it's a very important subject. And the burnout that Dieter had briefly mentioned, that is going to be a very interesting subject for our future at work. So would you go to the next, please, David? So talking about the 4th piece that has emerged, leaders must reconnect to disconnect. That's Dieter just mentioned. We see that a big issue for the leadership today and for the future. It's an interesting paradox because at the time when we are connected all the time, we see the workforce has never felt more disconnected. It's something that we have to work because it's totally related to the culture of the environment that we are inserted inside the companies and in our society. So we see that the younger and junior workers are feeling the consequence the most. The culture that, I mean, the way that we do things here is totally compromised, totally different from before. And the pandemic changed our lives, and that is going to be a very important subject to look for the future. So if you look at the data, 77% of managers, they say they are satisfied with their own performance, while only 57% of the direct reports agree. So it's a lack of self-perception, and that's something that we have to look at the company and as we work as a leader. The work environment that in the digital position that we see today, and the lack of the cultural pieces, we see that a lot of exchange feelings and tacit behaviors that are inputted for the culture we are missing. So digital, online, remote, it's the way that we are doing things, hybrid, but we still are missing one very important piece that will shape company culture in the future. And the leadership role is very, very important in doing that. Would you move to the next, please, David? So a great re-evaluation is important. They see the study shows that no great resignation is coming, but it's a big question mark. We're not sure. We have to look at the life purpose, as Dieter just mentioned, and it's in light of the great threat that was the pandemic, became a fundamental reflection and conversation. So what we are doing here and what we are working for, what's going to be the future I'd like to design, what am I doing? So that's very important, that subject that emerged from the study. And we must understand not just what we do, but why we do it. That's a very fundamental question that the leadership today is not prepared to deal with. So it's the reevaluation starts with the leadership. It's something that if you look at the data, I mean, almost 25% of the workforce are considering to move to another career path, to moving to another country or another region. It's a very, very strong number. If you look at another data, I mean, three quarters of people want to change their career. 75%. It's a very tough number. And just 37% of employees believe their companies effectively invest in developing their skills. But 66% of the workers believe they have to upskilling and reskilling. So it's another big gap that we have to fulfill. So a big reevaluation is required for the future. And as a conclusion, we saw that there are warning signs for companies with employees reassessing their careers. Companies must use the momentum that we are living to reassess their talent, and it can help them to rediscover themselves and reconnect their purpose. So it's our final appeal. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jose. And as I'm listening here, and I'm surprised you didn't nod more with your former speakers. Now, you know, a lot of things that you were mentioning here, like with the management that you know, the new management style that Edward was talking about, or that where Dieter, you know, you are touching on equality, for example, and those things. So what was going through your head when you heard them mention your things? Because you're kind of tying this together now. In this great evaluation. Any thoughts?
It's many thoughts. No, that's sometimes we end up lost where to start. But I think the most important piece to me is just starting about the self-knowledge or self-awareness, that to understand where we are and what we are doing, we have to understand ourselves. I mean, the emotional intelligence plays a very important role in this scenario. So that's the first step when you are asking where to go with those things happening, because we're going to face another pandemic in the future. No, probably not. But if it comes, how we are prepared to face it. So we have to understand ourselves first, then to start acting as leaders to help the environment and the ecosystem that we are in.
Thank you. Now, so here's a word to our audience. As you're seeing these red threads, this is actually, we did not really plan this through. So this came organically because we each created all our own slides with, you know, the messages that we wanted to say. And it just really proves that we're all on, you know, we're on the same path, and we're really sort of getting to the same ideas, which to me is kind of, you know, at least a slight proof that we're onto something. And that the world is really moving aligned in one direction. I hope you all agree. Looking forward to have some more chats and questions there. There's no questions for you, Jose. So with that, over to the next speaker, which is, I believe, me.
Yeah.
Yay. So I'll introduce myself to myself, and then I'll interview myself. That's fun. Cue next slide, please. And you can move straight to the next one. So when the pandemic started, 2 years ago, this is Satya Nadella, who's the global CEO of our company. He said, after a couple of months, we saw 2 years of digital transformation in 2 months. Now, the interesting thing here is our customers came to us and said, how can you keep working? It's a hybrid work, and we have a pandemic and everyone needs to work from home, and you guys just keep doing what you've been doing and just like, all right, I'll just work from home tomorrow. You've got it figured out already. And tell us, how you're doing this. And the customers asked us to talk about how we work, because, it's not about the products. The digital transformation, and the word digital transformation, is about people. It's not about digital at all. It's about how you are using those tools. And it can be a hammer and a screwdriver, or it can be a chat tool. So when you look at digital transformation, and yellow marked, if you would take a PC magazine and then you just take a yellow marker and then you just go everything that's got 4.0 on it, or digital transformation or digitalization, I mean, it's kind of buzzwordy, isn't it? So with that, cue next slide, please, David. Thank you. It's kind of also interesting because we already heard about trust in Dieter's presentation today. So I'm going to talk specifically about our journey to the workplace of trust and work hours of trust. It started 2013. There was a point when we at Microsoft, we realized, we can work from anywhere, because now we all have laptops and we make sure everyone has a company phone. So you don't have to come in the office. When I started at the company, you had a desk side, something under the desk. That was your computer and not the thing under your arm. But, at that point, everyone had that. So we had to negotiate with Works Council and HR, because you can't just go, just go work from home. And we realized this when we then launched it and say, hey guys, workplace of trust, and you can work flexible from when you need it, when you are the most efficient. This is one of the key things, that people are people, as Depeche Mode sang in the 80s. If you've got a family, you might be differently efficient because you've got kids at home, you need to bring them at school, and you come in early in the morning. No one sees you come in early. Everyone sees you leave early. Yeah, we've been there since, we were yuppies in the 90s. So with that, there's some people that are super efficient at their night owls. They got their Red Bull and they're happy at night programming and engineering, and others are more efficient in the day. So we tried to establish that, and we had a working model, and then we said, ta-da, and what happened? Nothing, really much. Because we hadn't thought of the change management, which is also, several things we've heard today. You need to take people by the hand and lead them through. How do I manage if I'm a team leader? If I suddenly need to manage a team that is distributed, first, the team I hired to be on site, and half of them are on site, and one moved away, but they're still in the team, and the other one doesn't come in, and because of the commute. And then suddenly you start hiring people from somewhere else. It's a churning machine where lots of moving parts were happening all the time. And with that, we realized that we really need to think this through. And we did, because we needed to talk to our customers about it. Because if we're telling our customers, this is how you should work, and you can use our technology, for example, we need to walk the talk. And that's the reason why we took this absolute commitment to go to the cutting edge of hybrid work and workplace of trust and work hours of trust. Next slide, please. And what we're realizing today is, the dimension of a hybrid workplace nowadays, when we're coming back from the pandemic, people are now asking us, and there's a lot of, I've been on so many panels and discussions, what's happening afterwards, once all countries are really back, because we're still not there. We're seeing now Asia, China are going back to lockdowns, for example. So, we're going to have some volatile movements across the globe for another, probably a couple of years, if we're realistic. But we are getting ready for it. And this is why we have this, this event today, actually, right, David? Nod and smile. Because it's important to talk about it now, all these dimensions. The dimensions that we have identified is, first of all, the work site. And there's 3 work sites. It's at the office, and then there's at home, so home office. And there's a third one, which is from A to B. You're in the car, you're on the move, you're waiting at the doctor's, you're on your way to the airport, you're in the air, you've already boarded, and the stewardess are telling you to switch off your phone, but you still got it, That's the work site. Work location makes a massive difference because of time zones. For example, here's one of the things that you can do to make sure someone feels included when they're not working in your work zone, because you've got a distributed team, engineers all over the world, where, for example, record your meetings so that if it's in an awkward time for someone, they can still be included. If you're really, going beyond, you even mention them and say, hey, we recorded this for you, Sandra, today in Australia, because, you couldn't be with us. So let's get going with it. Very small things of empathy that we also heard today that you can do to feel people included, even if you're having work locations and distributed teams, even in large organizations across the world. And that also leads to the work hours, because of course your time zone, steers your work hours. But at the same time, it's also your personal situation. If you are, if you have a family or not, and when you are the most efficient, as I said before. So the work hours can also be distributed. And they very often nowadays are split up so that you even do some in the morning and, you got a late call at night. I think something that we need to establish is that it's in your hands to take that time back. If you're having a 16-hour day because you have late calls, you just have to have the courage to go, guys, I'm out for 4 hours this afternoon doing my shopping because I'm going to work late tonight. Of course, this is when you're working in information worker situations, but still, all those are aspects to consider, and we can have some conversations about after all the speakers. Go to the next slide, please. Importance of technology. Now, of course, here we could go for hours on this one. I want to go back to the question we had about, how to measure empathy and how you can use tools for that. So there's one startup, I bet there's more, but here in Germany that I talked to, they use AI, and they have built an app that does face recognition and tests your stress levels if you are in a flow or if you need a break, if you're going too fast or too slow, and it tells you that, okay, time for a break, or you're in flow mode, keep going, using AI. So it's interesting to see how new companies are now starting to, for the well-being of employees, to think how we can use technology for that. And another thing is using AI for managing teams. For example, there's something that we are just implementing here now for something called Insights for Managers. Is, we got so many data points. So, for example, what we have through studies realized is the sweet spot for attrition of employees is to have a one-on-one with your manager every 2 weeks, not every week and not every 3 or 4 weeks, 2 weeks. That's where the attrition is the lowest and the happiness is the highest. So that's, we realize that that's a good flow. So, for example, this tool then pops up and tells the manager, so here's an overview of your team, and with these 2 people, you currently don't have a one-on-one schedule for this month. Do you want to schedule this now? So giving system nudges, including giving kudos. Have you told someone good job today? And you can easily just go in there and give a, hey, good job on that product or that campaign, either with the whole team seeing it or just to that one person. Because sometimes we forget to say good job. And it's one of the most beautiful things you can say to someone. Hey, I appreciate what you did this week. I saw that you worked really hard. So these kind of system nudges that you can then, just configure to which ones you want to have can help a manager, really drive that empathy in a simple way until it becomes natural, if that makes sense. Next slide, please. No, very shortly on the physical workspace. Now we believe, you don't go to work. I think you're going to go to work to meet people. So it's more about having the meeting place and also showcasing technology and what you have. Now, there's actually one thing that's very important to point out, and that sometimes you do have to work at work. And there are people that need to focus versus other people that need to collaborate. So what we are doing right now is that we are creating quiet zones. It's like a library where you don't say a word, everything, you don't say hello and your phone's off, which is also very interesting to include people with neurodiversity, for example, people with autism and Asperger's, because they have a very high demand for, a very quiet work environment. And they can, if they have the right environment, they are super efficient and very, very honored employees of ours. I know several who very openly say, yeah, I've got autism and I work here and I'm an engineer, and they're great people, but they do need this. So it's about recognizing, what certain people need so they can be efficient. And then we got the introverts and the extroverts, and everyone should have a place. So the workplace needs to be a workplace for everyone. And that needs to be reflected in the furniture, because there's a difference if you got sofa corners to sit and chat close to the coffee machine, or separate where you can really be, have quiet in a corner for yourself so you can focus. Next slide, please. And that's the last one. It's one of the things we've learned is digital exhaustion. You can do a lot with digitalization, but in the end, we also need to, plan in. And I think, Dieter, you had some of this as well, right? Your purpose. It's not just about working yourself to, mental breakdown. To be efficient, to have fun at work, you do need the breaks as well. And there's brain scans that can even prove this. So one of the things that we're trying to use technology for is to also build in breaks. That, if you go into your email system, there's one from us and there's others as well. You can now set configurations in most of them saying, if you click half an hour meeting, it's going to give you 25 minutes. You don't have to manually adjust. And we took the decision. So 30 minutes meetings are now always 25. And our meetings are a max of 50. And the system does that automatically to build in those breaks. So to combat digital exhaustion, we can use digital tools to help us remember that we need to build in breaks and take care of each other. So with that, that was my last slide. I will see if there's any questions here.
Anna, can I ask you a question whilst
yes, please.
waiting for it?
Yeah.
What you're showing is it's fascinating in the sense that what I might call the boundaries between work have now between work and home and just about every other space in our lives has disappeared. Now, this has enormous implications for education. It may be something that we might want to take up later when we come together as a group of panelists, but what are we doing to prepare people for this? Because we all know how addicted we can become, whether we build in these breaks or not. We've got to do our look at our emails. We've got to go on and find this out instantly on Google or Wikipedia or whatever it is. What about the human discipline that is needed alongside all of this extraordinary work that you can now do around the idea of the mobile workplace?
It's interesting, and as you're saying, it's in education as well as in the workplace. I mean, it starts there, doesn't it? So, it's a good way of, establishing those different work modes so that it's something that people do automatically. Now, a little bit, it's about taking care of each other, because there are going to be people that just can't let go and keep working. And very often there's a reason for that. Being a workaholic is no fun. It's almost, you could say, a sickness. So, if you see someone that actually does it, doesn't let go and, tell them to get a life, could be, a start. I think that's the role of the manager, to make sure you're seeing how it's balanced. And this is actually hi, Michael, thank you for your point here on management styles. That's exactly the thing. There used to be a time where the role of the manager was to show direction and do the bossing and tell everyone what they should be doing. Whereas now the ideal employee is self-driven, self-motivated, and they plan their own work and they plan their own targets and goals that plug into the company goals. But then that means that the ideal role or the ideal profile of a manager means someone that is more empathic, someone that is used to flat hierarchy, someone that trusts that if you give someone a goal that, they're going to find their way there without you telling them every step. And it's about them listening to people and understanding who needs what, who needs more direction. A young person straight out of university needs a bit more. Someone's been around for a long time, let them do their job. You trust them that they're going to deliver the results. So it's quite interesting, as you're saying there. I think there's not that many manager studies or universities that really offer even a course of modern management and how to be empathic, because we're not fully there yet. But I think it's something that we can all, everyone here on the call today and every one of the speakers, we evangelize this. This is why we're here to talk about it today. And this is how we can bring that out in the world, if that makes sense.
Thank you. Do we have any other questions for Anna at this point?
I'm just quickly reading here. There's a lot of tears. Rethink organizational designs. Well, that's, which Dieter also touched upon. And, I want to, at the top there saying, before we realize what's needed, you need to understand the need of the different organizational designs before you can design them. If you design them without the need, you're probably going to come up with something super cool and funky, and people are just going to go, yeah, I don't feel my space here. So they might organically develop themselves. But that means that we need to be very open, so that if you're seeing different work styles, I'll give you one example from a very large company, Siemens. There was a team, the team lead left, and the team was asked, this was Siemens Healthineers here in Nuremberg, the team was asked, do you need a new manager? So no, we don't. And the company listened and said, okay, you do it yourself. And they started rotating, and depending what needed doing, someone who had the strength went in maybe to represent the team in leadership meetings and so on. And guess which team compared to the other team was the most efficient and happy? Because so the company listened and said, okay, you're saying you don't need a new manager. Well, okay, let's try this out. It's going to be exciting to do all the finding out of what really works if companies are just open to the flexibility and, to try out new models, and please document how it's going so we can all learn from it. So with that, I'll read through some more of the comments, but in the interest of time, but we're doing really well actually, and great discussions. So dear, are you ready to jump in? It's your turn to talk about future of innovation.
Yes, I am, Anna. So I think I'll take off from where Anna left us, because she comes from Microsoft, and the seeds of the future of work were sown by Microsoft 15 years ago when they spoke of the new world of work. Okay, it was about the consumerization of IT, where people would want to use the same tools at work and at home. Let me also tell you about the Gartner's definition of future of work. It's how work will get done over the next decade, influenced by technology, generational and social shifts. From where I am in the Silicon Valley and in the role that I am, I will try to present a different perspective than the issues associated with being remote and virtual organization management, HR practices, and work culture management. To me, future of work is anything that makes working easier. Okay, the pace of technology and expectation of people to have frictionless experience is resulting in situations of constant, unpredictable change that is now the norm in many industries. Okay, so if you look at this slide, I think this was covered by Dieter earlier, and the who is about the people and culture. Okay, that is the people who are engaged, empowered, and this could be full-time workers, part-time workers, crowdsourced, gig workers, and so on. Where and when is about the space and connectivity. Okay, we're talking about fluid schedules, we're talking about remote work, we're talking about co-working, secure environments, connected environments, and so on. But what is most interesting for me is the how part of it. Okay, when we talk of enabling how the work is done in the emerging and shifting paradigm, okay, the most common thing that comes to our mind is workplace collaboration, messaging, voice and video, calendar meetings. Slack and Zoom have already become category defining startups. But let's look at this from the skills augmentation angle, the collaboration between humans and technology. We live in a very historic era today, and there is a force shift caused by the pandemic in the nature of work and workplace, and the who, when, where of the work is changing, and the new technology is upending the status quo. Okay, so there are these two storms that are creating a perfect storm for innovation, okay, which defines the how of the future of work. Next slide. There are these four, slide before. Yeah, before. One back, yeah. There are the four interrelated trends that are challenging and unwinding these old rules, but I will focus on just two of them right here, okay? Increased automation is undercutting mechanistic thinking upon which most organizations are created. Okay, so the management belief in control and predictability is becoming obsolete. Okay, decision circles versus hierarchical bureaucracy is now setting in. These societal shifts are also, we can look at the generational shifts, are caused by the new workforce that is coming into work. Okay, Gen Z have different career aspirations. Their emphasis is more on social impact and career mobility. 61% of the millennials are interested in freelancing work. Okay, 51% of baby boomers are interested in getting back to work as freelancers. Okay, so freelancing is on the rise in the US. Okay, almost about 45-50% is inclined towards freelancing. At the same time, 40% of the companies are reporting talent shortage. So how do you bridge that gap? Okay, the one way is to do gig workers and freelancers, but there are jobs that cannot be handed over to gig workers, and those are targets for automation. Next slide. Next slide. So what do we mean by automation? At its most basic, automation is the substitution of human activity by machines. Okay, so the routine, cognitive, manual work, which is the low-hanging fruit for automation, effectively it is taking robotic activities out of a human. Okay, what is called as robotic process automation. On the other hand, if you see that there are non-routine, cognitive, and manual work, okay, will increase, and there is an effort to find a way to put a human into the robot. Okay, what we call as machine intelligence. Okay, today this is symbolized by teleoperated robots, okay, doing increasingly clever things such as clinical surgery. So automation also includes that which is less visible, okay, such as the use of AI and machine learning to read documents, control autonomous vehicles, redesign the work of people in contact centers using chatbots and so on. So according to the World Economic Forum, the division of labor between human and machines, okay, is going to increase from 30% to about 50% by 2025. Okay, and that's a very telling story. Next slide, please. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the innovation economy because that is the new force in the modern capitalism. Okay? And entrepreneurship is the process that results in creating new products, okay, and replacing the existing products and methods, okay, with the new production methods and new ways of using the products. The innovation we are seeing today is radical in nature. Okay, we live in an era of innovation that is characterized by high uncertainty, completely revolutionary technology, and delivering unprecedented product features that were not heard of before and which are completely transformative in nature. Okay, so radical innovation solves problems in completely different ways. Okay, in the ways we didn't know it could be done. Okay, completely transforming how we work. For example, an AR solution for machine maintenance, okay, with an ability to call remote support person to resolve complicated issue is a classic example of what radical innovation is capable of doing. So we are currently in this new wave of innovation where speed and complexity is very, very exponential. There are at least 5 such innovations happening, as you can see on the slide, and of which AI and robotics are the ones that are directly impacting the future of work, while things like blockchain, energy storage, etc. are the enablers that are supporting that. Okay. For at least the next 50 years, the markets are going to be dominated by companies that succeed in this new way of innovation. Okay, next slide, please. In order to bring this radical innovation to the future of work, we need to have confluence of technology. Okay, the innovations we see today are driven by interconnected technologies. These technologies are creating new industries like robotics, drones, autonomous vehicles, wearable devices, and they're completely disrupting our historic view of traditional industrial sectors, the traditional occupations, and also the consumer markets. Industry 4.0 is a classic example where IoT, smart machines, blockchain, or what we call as distributed ledger technology, machine vision, machine intelligence, cloud robotics are all working together to deliver a new way of working in the manufacturing organizations. Artificial intelligence, additive manufacturing, 3D printing, virtual and augmented reality, autonomous things, drone robotics, 5G, edge computing are all the technologies that promise to change the future of work. Thank you.
So with that, thank you. I'll have a look. We don't have any questions right now there. And as I bet Mark is now raring to go before we go into the final discussions. Mark, are you ready to just jump in on this and deliver the final piece, the grand finale today?
Okay, I'm certainly glad to sit through this, and it's been, really fascinating for me to hear about all this. Of course, I live it as well, being part of a large organization and being a bit of a technophobe myself, or technophile, excuse me, not a technophobe. But in any case, what I would like to do is to cast this in a sort of a bigger picture and to really try to impress upon you that the future work is ours to create. And I'm not thinking so much about the tools and technology, but how we envision the employment system. So before I talk about the choices we have moving forward, I want to go back in time just a bit. And I want to go to the next slide here, where I want to highlight the work of Jacob Hacker at Yale University, who, about 15 years ago, wrote a book called The Great Risk Shift. And this great risk shift is a shift of risk from capital to labor. And essentially, over time, and we'll show you a little bit data in just a bit, we have, as a society, at least from a North American perspective, but I believe this now permeates Europe, have assumed that the responsibility for human capital development is the individual. It's not so much the organization. So whereas in the past, we would want the organization to invest in the skills development of employees, over the last 30 years, it's been pretty convenient for employees, for organizations to discard employees who maybe don't have the skills and then go back to that external market to find them. All of you sitting through this webinar in the EMBA program, you know the cost of bearing your own human capital expenses, right? You're investing a lot of money and a lot of time. However, you probably will be forced to do this again in 10 or 20 years as you need to continue to keep your skills sharp. Another way this is related is the fact that one time very large organizations had a semblance of employment commitment, at least to management employees. What we've seen, however, is that employment security is gone. Since 1992, it's been rather routine for large organizations to have large-scale layoffs, regardless of employee contributions, feeling that they can rebuild their labor forces again from the external markets. I recall in 2008, just at the precipice of the Great Recession, 3M laid off 3,000 PhDs prior to the onset of the recession. Of course, they had great, smart people and analytics at 3M to see the recession coming. 3M did not miss a beat. It was great for shareholders. Shareholders did not lose a dime. However, the human cost of 3,000 scientists being laid off and having to relocate out of Minnesota shouldn't be understated. We also see this in the area of safety and health. On a sort of purely mechanistic perspective, the cost and benefits of worker comp has really shifted to employers in the name of trying to root out fraud in the worker comp system. We see this though now that in our new definition of who's an essential worker in the pandemic, right? The essential worker is the grocery store worker. Do they get a wage premium for this? Do they get greater respect from their employers or society? Not what we expect if they're so essential. And finally, and I'll come back to this later because it's really, really substantial, we've had a restructuring of pensions. Once upon a time, not too long ago, I'm probably about 5 years too young for this benefit, but most people in large organizations, including at IBM, would have a defined benefit. They would work a certain number of years, 20 years, 25 years, 30 years, and based on the length of their employment, they would get a certain percentage of that salary. We still have that, of course, ever in the US military and diplomatic corps, of course, but we don't have that broadly in private industry. What we have instead are defined contributions that we are able, through taxes and such, make a contribution to our 401k plan, and this then is matched by our employer. Next slide, please. And so really what we've seen, and of course, there's been an ideology that would sort of work around this. And so we had this notion that, oh, it's okay, individuals now are liberated from having to work for one employer. They could develop these protean careers where they could shift shape and become what they want. And also it worked well with this notion of individual responsibility, that you have control of your destiny. You can change and upgrade and skill. And we celebrated this protean career. In terms of human resources, and my great professional colleagues in human resources, they became very, very adept at transacting that external market, trying to figure out how best to subcontract employees or how best to recruit the best people, and also know when to let them go. The impact of this is seen on the next slide, where you see up until 1970, Americans basically, regardless of their sort of economic standing in society, enjoy pretty much comparable wage growth. But as we see this sort of great shift kick in 1980, you can see this right on that graph. This is where we really see this divergence, that those of us who are fortunate enough to be in that top 5th percentile, we've seen real wage gains upwards of 80%, where those people who are in the bottom 20th percentile or even at the median have had very, very, very modest wage growth. If you go on to the next slide, you'll see that now this is being further exacerbated, right? So we see this great risk shift. This is a combination of social policy and corporate policies. But remember I mentioned that change in pensions? Well, that change in pensions affects just about everybody who's born after 1960. And that change in pensions basically says you are responsible for your own retirements. So what we've done is we've been schooled, especially those of us fortunate to be in the top 5%, to save enough money so that we could have a comfortable retirement until we're 100. That's great, particularly if you live to 100. But most people don't live to 100. Most people live to 85. And so in a sense, those people who are fortunate enough to save have oversaved. And currently, we're anticipating that there's going to be a great wealth transfer over the next 20 years. This wealth transfer could be as much as $70 trillion, but it's not a redistribution from wealthy to less wealthy. It's a redistribution between generations. So in the next 10 years, the Wall Street Journal reported some studies where they anticipate $35 trillion will be transferred by those of us who are getting old and are looking at these really nice fat retirement accounts. And, we're saying, I'm a bit of a realist here. Despite all the innovation in Silicon Valley, immortality is not around the corner. We are all mortal. We are probably going to have shortened lifespans. So just how much money is $35 trillion? Well, it's 27% of the total US wealth. And you have to remember, these are people who are over 70. So this $35 trillion, I forgot to say, this is wealth held by individuals who are 70 years and older. Doesn't count Elon Musk, doesn't count Mark Zuckerberg or anything like that. It doesn't even count me. I'm not quite there yet, but that's an awful lot of money. It's 157% of the US GDP. Now, at the same time that we have this sort of great wealth transfer, simultaneous with it, we have 40% of US citizens who are entirely dependent on Social Security as their sole means of retirement. So at the same time that we see this massive wealth transfer to the top 5%, to the kids of the top 5%, we see that 40% of Americans, retirees, live solely on Social Security payments, which are averaging about $1,400 a month. So if you go to the next slide, I'll say we really have a choice here, and it's a strategic choice. It's a human choice that we can make through social policies and companies. We can continue along the way we are, where we essentially privatize individual risk, and we have flexible work for those of us who are fortunate enough to be able to work in an environment where it's flexible, and we could have a sense of where there is atomization, meaning individuals separate. So whereas Germany has its works councils that at least institutionalize employee voice, in the United States we have nothing like that, and we certainly have nothing like that when we see unionization at 6% of the private sector, and that where the workers demand too much money, we simply decide to automate where we can. Or we could see a future where there is an assumption of shared risk, that indeed companies cannot take advantage of this asymmetry of power and simply move risk to individuals, but we accept that companies will bear some of the risk and maybe retain employees in bad times, but perhaps with the idea that there is shared opportunity there because we know the costs of reinvesting in people and start hiring in them. And we could think of creative ways that individuals who haven't been able to have the labor power to earn the higher salaries to figure out a way so that even individuals who are outside of that 5% can find creative ways to add to organizations and then earn the money that they can then sort of earn through the value added that they create. This is within our capacity, It's a combination of both social policy and creative management. We see in the United States right now that not all companies have sort of taken this low road to wealth. We do have companies that have developed high performance work systems with highly engaged workers, but the economics for these companies, really sort of, leave it to the faith of the leaders and the commitment of leaders to make this work. Because as we look at least social policy in the United States, as well as, current trends in management, we do not see enough organizations using the creativity that I know is out there to figure out ways to allow other individuals in the organization outside of that top 5% to really contribute to organizations. And on that note, I'm ready for questions.
Thank you so much. Well, Mark, so my first thought here is thinking about, you are mentioning all those who might not have such a straightforward path, to flexible work, as you're saying, available to some. What about all the others? Which is actually also a question that came here in the chat that I thought we might bring in here. It's easy for big, computer companies to think about these things, but what about those who aren't so fortunate? For example, also developing markets. What's your thought on that? That would be a good question for you, maybe, for this point.
I'm sorry, so what is the question on it?
The question was, so how can we, let's see here, I'm scrolling. And it was from Sufyan, who did. So how could the less developed countries benefit from this wave of digitalization despite the constraint related to infrastructures, electricity, reliable and high-speed internet? I'm building a little bit about, on top of, there's even in developed countries, there's companies that might not have the same opportunities, both from a legal perspective.
Yes, great question. And so,
right, yeah.
Yeah, and again, and well, and I see we have people, I presume from Kuzminski University in Poland, and I've lived in Japan, and I have, I think I spent 8 years of my 20s overseas. So I do have a sense of the world, though I must say that my sort of presentation here is presenting a North American perspective, but let me sort of take this a little bit further. And I think, candidly, to some extent, what we need is, and we see it already, is sort of almost a renewed nationalism at one level, which I'm sure is horrific in the context of the kind of wars we're seeing right now. But what I mean here is, the top 5% of individuals in their own countries figuring out a way to work on these, issues, within their countries. I would not want, from an American perspective, to sort of impose that, but I'll share something that I find very promising. And what I was speaking to a colleague at Cummins, which used to be called Cummins Engines, but since they're going to be electrifying, they are now just Cummins. And so they made a decision to open up all job postings globally. Anybody, anywhere in the world could apply for any job at Cummins anywhere in the world. And so on the one hand, you had individuals who were concerned that this would cause a massive brain drain from Southeast Asia in particular to the United States, as people in Asia and the Indian subcontinent would want to come to the United States. And Cummins was committed to paying those people transportation as well as a local salary in the United States. But what they found is people stayed put. Oftentimes, through social selection, people were marrying other professionals, and if you were a married couple and moved by, why bother to move to the United States where you weren't close to your family and your kids would be disrupted and you would have a different diet and different places of worship and what have you. And so what Cummins have found through this experiment is that their professionals are staying in their home countries. Now, what does that mean for how technology would be used in each of these countries? Well, in some cases, that's not a problem because obviously, some developing countries have leapfrogged, the United States in terms of internet connectivity. So, I can't speak to that, but I can speak to this trend of, of professional employees remaining in their own countries or leaving perhaps and then returning. Now, I know that doesn't quite answer the question there, but it's my best I could do.
Can I come in with the question, Mark? I mean, it seems to me that there are big issues around dignity here and human value, because you're looking at a complete disparity between a very rich, top of the milk section, the cream of society, and that in the American context, a large proportion of people who are surviving pretty well on subsistence level, as we might define it. And that's a question of human dignity. And so I just wonder, do we need a change in terminology and a change in attitude so that we don't even talk about unemployment in the future, but is something like a universal basic wage, is that a cop-out, or is it something whose time has come? How do you feel about that?
Well, you know, to some extent, I would want to have the data speak to it, if you will, and there are interesting experiments. You know, I'm hesitant to endorse something as, you know, dramatic as, you know, the universal wage without sort of doing the math, but I do want to address this notion of disincentive to work, which is often tied to the universal minimum wage. The idea being, well, if we provide people some money, then they won't have an incentive to work, and therefore they will not have human dignity. As I observe, you know, the generations who are going to be coming into this fortune, it's odd to me that nobody talks about the disincentive for these individuals to work, right? And if you think about it from a sociological perspective, you know, this would be the strata of society which would, if you will, be, you know, producing the professionals and the engineers of the next generation. But if they're coming into money and they know they're coming into money, why be challenged to do that difficult thing? But what I will say, David, is this: I do believe that if we see continuity moving forward, where we see, you know, this division that touches, as you say, human dignity, then it is a threat to democracy. It's very, very challenging to see how we have democratic governance where we have such, you know, broad and difficult social divides. And particularly when we see this sort of myth. So for instance, if you go back to the slide of that 95%, the counter argument would be, well, what if there are different people coming into that top 5%? It's not static, right? So the numbers aren't quite as bad as you see. So when I was a graduate student at MIT, we were talking about the returns on education. And, you know, I was in that, you know, bottom 20% at that time with my wife. And we sort of took that research very seriously. And she went to dental school, I went to MIT, and indeed the math worked, you know, there were strong returns to that education. But what we're finding in our research is my wife and I are more the exception than the rule, that those numbers tend to be, you know, not, can I say, the stratification is not quite as malleable as you might think. That you know, dropping out of that top 5% is less frequent than climbing into it is less frequent than the sort of, if you will, the myth of a meritocracy might speak to. So I do believe to some extent the anti-democratic trends that we see in the United States are in one way or another a direct result of not addressing this issue.
Thank you.
Thank you. So as we're going into like the general round Q&A here, and the question, the last one from Sufyan there, Edward, if I might pick you out here to give your thoughts on that, because you have a very global, you know, perspective about, you know, less developed countries and the benefits and so on. What are your thoughts on this?
I'm sorry, my thoughts on which issue specifically? There were so many.
Now, on the difference of basically less developed countries, and you've seen, you know, you've seen the world, you've been around, the difference in what, you know, in less developed countries and developed countries in digitalization, and just possibly what benefit this wave of digitalization, you know, could be, let's say,
sure.
I'm reading it. Benefit from this wave of digitalization despite the constraints related to infrastructures, electricity, reliable and high-speed internet. So basically that is a big difference. You know, what are the pros and cons for developed countries versus less developed countries?
Oh, certainly, yes. Unfortunately, I haven't been reading the chats because to do so, I would have to put my hands in front of the camera. So thank you for clarifying that. Yeah, certainly. I think the obvious problem which presents itself very vividly is a change, but a widening of what we've been calling the digital gap for about the last 20 years. if you want to put a date on the start of the internet age, it's really 1993. The World Wide Web first sort of went, the World Wide Web basically fired up around 1989, I believe in 1989. But about 4 years later, there was a browser called Mosaic, which was the precursor to Netscape, which was in turn the progressor of Explorer, which really opened things up. So Mosaic in June 1993 sort of kicked off what we now think of as the information age, the internet age. And that's only been less than 30 years. So in the last 20 years, we noticed a very profound separation. Some people called it the North-South gap. Some people called it the internet gap. Some people call it the digital gap. But you saw not only between societies, but within societies, you saw communities that had lots of access to the internet and others that didn't. And you saw extreme variation in the opportunities that were available and the economic potential that was unleashed by that. What we're going into now is really a totally uncharted territory. The world is going into uncharted territory now because on the one hand, many developing countries, many less developed countries do have quite good access to internet, but it is not as good as we enjoy in many of the more developed countries. So it's hard to see how, which way this is going to go. On the one hand, you see, for example, the ability to exchange currency using phones in places like sub-Saharan Africa has really revolutionized small businesses, for example, and particularly small businesses owned and run by women, because now they have their friends in other countries on the other side of the country or somewhere on the other side of the planet who can send them $10 or $15 using their phones. But this is a very far cry from being able to, for example, conduct the kind of seminar or conference that we're doing right now, or to actually work remotely from your home. Because still today, in most countries, most people are working in occupations that cannot be done virtually. The people who run the farms, the people who in the service industries, the people in the healthcare industries, the people in the hospitals, for example, and many things, and many of the crucial aspects of teaching. I personally believe that the future of teaching will be hybrid, because there are some things that are actually more fun to do and more interesting to do online, but nothing will ever completely replace the face-to-face communication and the body language that can be communicated face-to-face. So I think the real challenge is how to, I think that this digital divide is going to become more complicated and more difficult to manage and present new challenges to us in ways that we can't even really grasp yet, because we still haven't figured out exactly how to define and manage and have a more equal society just with what I would call, the old internet gap. And now so we're going to come up. So just as we solve one problem, or we start to come up with techniques to solve one problem, other issues are going to come up, and they're very, very complex, and they're highly interactive. And this is going to require, I think, a multidisciplinary approach. We're going to have people with entrepreneurial backgrounds, and people with strong theoretical backgrounds, and people with infrastructure backgrounds, and people with international law backgrounds, who are all going to have to work together to solve these problems in a collaborative fashion. And it remains to be seen whether or not governments are up to this, or whether or not the private sector is. Common sense would tell you that some of these problems are so large and so complex that governments must take a very active, proactive role in this. But if you look at the history of government, you see that governments tend to be very slow and very clumsy and very focused, and always a couple steps behind the problem rather than in front of it. So my personal suspicion is that while governments probably ought to take leading roles in fixing some of these problems, my suspicion is it's probably going to be the private sector, and it might even be entrepreneurs.
Thank you. Thank you. I see a couple of people are starting to drop off here. So kind of, maybe we'll go for a few more questions. There's one here from Malvin. What will become of the employee ownership schemes in companies? Are they likely to become less important or more important? I kind of feel this was probably directed towards you, Mark, and you're smiling.
Yeah, and I saw the question. I wanted to speak to Malvin about this. And we do have structures in the United States for employee stock ownership plans and such. And I certainly, as a young man, not surprisingly, was interested in such things. But what we found over time is part of it is the reality that when employees have an opportunity to participate in these plans, these companies are almost always financially in very, very deep trouble. So they have set up the situation where people will say, well, the factory could go bankrupt, or we could sort of assume ownership of the factory and try to make it work. And because of that, Malvin, we really don't have a lot of great models from this. But I'll also say something that I think all of us, at least on this panel, might agree with, is markets work pretty well. Capitalism works extremely well at creating innovation, at creating wealth. And capitalism has different forms, however. And the current form of capitalism that we currently have, where again, companies have taken advantage of the power that they have to sort of shift risk to individuals, of course, under the pressure of quarterly earnings and such, is something, again, within our control, because we don't have to go back far in our history to see a slightly different form of capitalism. We don't have to go very far globally to see other systems. So rather than sort of putting my faith in employee stock ownership programs, I would much prefer to see management come up with new employment systems, which figure out very creative ways to tap value throughout the organization.
Thank you. I hope that answers the questions. I'll see there's Eric Denkhaus just pinged something here as well. Thank you. How does the panel see the future of payment structures in the new era of hybrid working and working from anywhere? Do you think location-based pay will remain, and what does this mean for the location of skilled employees in the future? Now that's really interesting, because we have, so my stepson is a working nomad. I think he's in Thailand right now, working for a South African company, which is in the payment and finance sector. So I'll ask him that too, but it is indeed one of those, over the borders. For example, in Germany, if I choose to work in my home country, which is Sweden, I cannot just go there and do my work at unlimited amount of time because of tax implications. So I think this is where we definitely have the globalization, to have some homework to do, because there's still countries, there's still regulations about taxes and laws. I'll look here. So I see Edward's nodding, but Dieter's nodding as well. Dieter, you want to answer this, right? You want to get into this one?
Maybe a few thoughts. And I mean, I think firstly, there's a real, can I call it, operational challenge with that for a lot of organizations around, legislation and tax, and how much time do people spend in different areas. To flip the coin a little bit on the other side, I think where the argument does become interesting, though, is if I'm a company promoting remote work and promoting flexibility and choice, then I believe also there is this element around the fact that I have to chat to my employee, and we found that very extensively during the pandemic. A lot of people moved back to smaller towns, moved across the border, kept on working remotely for the organization because there was just no more need to go in. But that does impose this very interesting question around, what do we base pay on? Do we think about cost of living in a particular area, in a particular domain, or do we actually say, but what is the value and the worth of this work? Where does it take place? And then, it's up to the employee to decide what that looks like for them as well. And I'm making the point as part of, I think it's going to change how you think about your employee value proposition. Now, I do think it is much more complicated than that. And I think, Mark will talk a lot more around that in terms of the general employment system implication of that will have. But I think it is very interesting because we had a few examples in our organization, just from some people relocating between two different cities, and all of a sudden saying, but hang on, you used to pay me differently, but why? I'm doing the exact same work. The fact that I'm now living somewhere else has zero implication on you as an organization. Should you be docking my pay, or should you be paying me more? And I think it's an interesting thing for companies to start thinking about, how do you provide that consistency, and what is your principal approach with regards to that, whilst we figure out, a lot of these other elements, because I think In a company where I'm at the moment, we've got the exact same thing. We've got 25 different nationalities. For 4 weeks of the year, you can work from your home country, but you can't go beyond that. And depending on what your home country is, you then start facing tax challenges. And I don't think we've got an answer there yet. We do need to flesh that out a lot more. And I think it's a very interesting HR challenge in the EVP space to figure out.
Yeah, thank you. Edward, do you want to comment? Because you look like it. Here you go. Stage yours.
Well, yeah, I just want to add that I happen to know quite a bit about cross-country tax implications from my various careers and my own personal experience. And the fact of the matter is that countries now have to compete for talent. And but different countries have massively different tax rules. For example, in Japan, if you live in Japan for more than 5 years, they will tax you on your global income, and not just your income. They will also tax you on your global assets. So there's an old rule: don't die in Japan. Whatever you do, if you want to live in Japan, that's fine, but don't die in Japan, because they will tax you. And the Japanese inheritance taxes are the highest in the world. They go up to 55%. So no professional who has a lot of assets or very high income in their right mind would probably ever want to live in Japan for more than 5 years, unless Japan changes its tax rules. And one step beyond that, we're now seeing these tremendous flows of people in terms of where they live and where they, for example, invest. And where they invest and where they're spending their money. You know, many countries, they have consumption taxes as high as 20 or 25%. This is a lot of money. And so at some point, countries will have to, I think they will probably have to standardize. Again, standardization is something I'm studying right now, but I just don't see how companies with very, very high corporate taxes, very, very high personal income taxes, and very, very high inheritance taxes, I don't see how they can possibly be competitive in the long-term global war for talent. So I would look for more standardization, and I would also caution any of the students who are listening to this presentation that you need to think about these types of things when you're considering your future careers and where you want to live and where you want to work, and to use great caution and think very, very long-term, because the numbers that we're talking about, in my case, it became prohibitive. It became prohibitive for me financially to continue living in Japan, and that's when I moved back to the United States.
I learned a lot there just now. That was really interesting. Good, some good pointers. I'm going to read up on that. Anyone else who want to comment?
We have Katerina, who's raised her hand. Katerina, do you want to come online and ask your question?
Yes, thank you for your voice. Thank you for our panelists for your speech. It was very interesting to listen to you. I'm listening from the perspective of switching from, of course, perfect transformation from office, very stiff regulations. First of all, I'm from Poland, so maybe this is some kind of also location perspective, that switching to mobile hybrid work was very difficult. We are now very much open. Mostly I work from home currently, but I also work for a Chinese company, generally speaking. So I'm also interested from your perspective, how it looks like that switching to this hybrid work and switching to this flexibility from company's perspective by their original headquarters. Yes, because from my perspective, it varies a lot from Asia Pacific perspective by Europe and also the United States. When I have the feeling that the United States is America generally is much more flexible in this way, because it's a different perspective. Europe is quite fast switching to it. When Asia Pacific is, at least as I hear from my colleagues, there are lockdown is lockdown, then is home, then they're turning back. Yeah. So what is your perspective for that? Thank you for voice.
I have a point on that, which is it's very often depending on where the headquarters are. So for example, Microsoft, American company, globally, pretty much the same working style. But we do see that, really infusing that in countries like India that have a different style, it takes longer, and sometimes the trust is not fully there. totally opposite example. So the really German companies like Siemens, they just 2020, finally, we were actually doing some discussions with them, coming to the point where they said, okay, now we're going to allow 140,000 people to work from home, because their works council was scared, that, the people would, maybe not really come to clear with what's happening there. So, I mean, that is really one of the key points, is if the top-down decision is made from a headquarters perspective, where most of the people are located, like we are in Seattle, Siemens are here, I think that kind of steers the global saturation of this. Anything to add there? I think this is kind of your material, Dieter, right?
Yeah, I think to add there, I think it poses the interesting point also on how do you infuse organizational culture across different locations, because subcultures will emerge that is more aligned to the different locations and the different work styles that do originate in those areas. And I think it's always going to be a fine balance there between what top-down the organization, and I think the tendency is, comes from the headquarter environment where most of the senior decision makers are, that shape and influence a lot of the thinking pertaining to the organizational culture. I think there is also then that balance around how do you localize that to the different environments for something that works within that cultural context, because I do think that there's different perceptions around how and where and when we work that is associated with that. I think where it becomes interesting as well is now, if we are saying a truly global workforce, the argument that you could make, doesn't matter where I sit in the world, how does that then apply to me? And I think that's where it becomes interesting again around this question around, and Katrina, thank you for your question. You're sitting in Poland working for a Chinese company, and maybe your teammate is sitting in the US. What culture is now relevant? And that's again, to get back to my earlier point, that's where I think companies are going to have to be crystal clear around their principles of work, around what is acceptable and what's not acceptable. And I think as long as we've got that as a guiding framework, I think unfortunately it will work for some, for others it won't quite work, but at least I think there's things on the table to talk about, because it's a very difficult one. There's no one answer to this. And I think there's a lot of gray area for us still to explore.
If I could jump in as someone who is working in a hybrid environment, that sort of just evolved, if you will. It's nothing that was designed. I really want to work for Anna's company in Germany and at IBM. What Anna was describing sounded to me to be something that makes so much sense, because really you have to create a reason for people to want to be able to come to work. And when I say come to work, it doesn't mean the work is necessarily done there, though it can be. That's what's so wonderful about what Anna was discussing, that you have, I go to work, I go to the university to see my colleagues. But I also would like to, maybe on the days I see my colleagues, to find time to get into that heavy, focus mode where I can, without apologizing, go to a place where I could do that. And now I don't quite have that, right? Nor do most people. And so thinking along those lines now, in terms, and this is where I throw it to my colleagues who know a lot more than I do, what is now emerging in the United States are discussions about in crowds and out crowds. Will they develop a different ethic or a different culture amongst those individuals who prefer to go to the office and those who prefer to stay home, and how organizations will manage that? But I think Dieter began to sort of answer that question as well.
Can I come in on that too, just in terms of, we're talking about global workforce, working in Poland for a Chinese company, working in Germany or whatever, in a multinational organization, but what responsibility does that put on the organization? Let me just provide a little story, a little context. Here in Britain, there's a bit of a scandal at the moment. A company called P&O, which many of you will have heard of, summarily dismissed 800 of its staff last week on a video call, on the grounds that the British employees were costing them too much. They are going to be, therefore, recruiting people from the Philippines, from Latin America, from parts of Europe, where they believe they can start employing people at a far lower cost than they were bearing with their British employees. Now, their shareholders may well be happy with this, in the sense that this may well improve their bottom line. But what does it say about business and this notion of, in fact, being globally responsible?
It is interesting, isn't it? I mean, that's horrendous to hear a story like that, because that would not happen in Germany.
No, well, it may be a post-Brexit reality, but actually it could happen in Germany because their ships are not registered in Germany. Their ships are registered wherever it may be in the world, which is the lowest tax domain. And it's with that, and as they're working on the ships, they are, if you like, in a strange extraterritorial world when it comes to employment law. Yeah. So I'm just, we're talking about this great new world where we have this flexibility and this possibility. But if you're not in the in crowd, what is the race to the bottom on that respect? And I just wonder if any of our panelists would like to come back on the safeguards that we might need to put in if we're talking about responsible organizations.
Yeah, that's what I was saying. We have a very, clear works council driven. So if you're an employee by a German company, that's what I meant there.
Yeah.
This would never happen because there's a lot of justification needed, business justification for closing a plant or similar, if you want to do that. So I mean, certain countries have stronger protection. And I think, union and representation is also one of those topics that are complicated, in certain countries. You mentioned it, Mark, in the US, and of course, we're following the news and how things work there. For me, as a person I'm from Sweden, originally, where that is, pretty normal. We have quite high ethics. Is not understandable, you brush your teeth and you're in the union. It's like you do that unless you don't brush your teeth, but let's not go there. So I mean, that's a big question and a big topic that we could probably go on for.
Yeah, well, this is where I think Edward would probably have something to say. So I'm putting words in your mouth for a second, everything to speak to it, because David, this case of P&O, was it P&O, I believe, laying off these people, that was news in the US. Even in the US, we felt appalled by that. And that speaks to the norms. And so sometimes, laws will only do so much, but indeed, this is where sort of moral leadership is needed. And this is where I get to pass it on to Edward.
Well, how much time do I have?
I think about 4 minutes, and then we need to finish, or 2, according to Anna. Yeah.
Okay. I'll make this really, really quick then. Well, we in the past, companies could get away with almost anything. They could get away with almost anything because people didn't know about it. It never really penetrated the conscience of a community. What companies did, because they were sort of firewalled by the extent of how much communication could be communicated by word of mouth. Basically, word of mouth was the limit as to how far information about executive behavior would reach. The game changer, the real game changer, especially in the last 15, 20 years, is social media. Now that we have social media, now that we have YouTube, now that we have TikTok, now that we have WhatsApp, we have all these things. When a company does something like this, everybody around the world knows about it in just a couple of hours or a couple of days. And increasingly, we are seeing that consumers will vote with their feet. Even if the board of directors or the senior management of a company, if they're okay with a decision like this, their customers may not be. And it's not a coincidence that the first example of grassroots opposition to corporate behavior caused a complete revolution in that company's behavior. And the example I'm thinking of is Nike. The example of Nike was in 1991, and this was before the internet. This is by email. Okay, one college student with an old desktop computer almost took down a multi-billion-dollar company by spreading word via email messages that Nike was operating in sweatshops in Southeast Asia, and that people should boycott the company if they didn't like it. And now you have this phenomenon magnified 1 billion times with companies like Facebook, which has 1.9 billion users right now. And so I don't see that companies can do this sort of thing now safely. They're taking a huge risk making these kinds of decisions because the possibility of a backlash or a boycott, a global boycott against their products, is now a very real possibility.
I agree. I commented some of the same, so I'm not going to go into. I was thinking of saying. Can you repeat what you said? People vote with their feet. Was that what you just said?
Yes, saying people vote with their feet means that even someone like me who does not have a vote on the board of directors of a company that fires 800 people, presumably by a Zoom call or an email or something like that. I don't have a vote on their board of directors. I cannot directly impact their managerial decisions. But I can vote with my wallet, if you will. I can vote with my wallet by not purchasing that company's goods or services and telling all of my friends, like on the Zoom call we're doing right now, or via social media, to do the same, and asking them to tell all their friends to do the same. And pretty soon, if you're a corporate manager, you've got a big problem on your hands.
Thank you. David, should we slowly come to?
I think we have to try to round up now. Yeah,
because on that, I would just say for everyone listening here, use your feet and your wallet when you're voting for ethical and moral decisions. We can all change the world. And I was really happy to have you all here. And with that, that was my famous last words. Handing over to you, David, to close.
Thank you. I just wanted, on everybody's behalf here, to say thank you so much to our panelists. All of them gave, I think you'll agree, fantastic presentations. It was a very lively session. I certainly don't think anybody watching it could have been bored for a moment, and that they couldn't have been Zoomed, or it wasn't in this instance, and Microsoft Teams out. They would have enjoyed that. And thank you so much for doing this. It is something, as I say, that we hope to continue on other themes in the future. And I hope all of you who've taken part in your various schools will also now consider coming on the EMBA Consortium International Week, which I would just share this a second so that you can see what we're offering in September. And you will be hearing about this over the next days and weeks, wherever you are in the world. But once again, thank you all so much for participating. Thank you, Anna, for doing a fantastic job in moderating. Thank everybody who contributed to this, both amongst our speakers and our audience. And on that note, after more than 2 hours, we will end the meeting. So good luck to you all, and hope to see you soon. Thanks. Bye.